Often new soccer fans will ask me, what's the difference between a club team like Manchester United or the Los Angeles Galaxy and a national team like the US men's or women's national teams? Can a team like the Chicago Fire compete in the World Cup? If someone plays for a professional team, can they still play for a national team? Or if they move from club to club, does that affect which country they play for? The world of professional soccer is complex, and if you have wondered about any of these questions, you are in the right place. I'm Tai Fujimura from the We the Peeps US Soccer Podcast, and I'm here to help you learn everything that you need to know about how national teams work. Let's get started.
It's we the people. It's we the people.
So what is a national team? National soccer teams represent individual countries, and they're composed of all the best players from that particular country, wherever they play professionally, or even if they don't play professionally at all, such as was the case when Jordan Morris, who was a Stanford student at the time, was called up to play for the US men's national team. Players are selected or called up by the coaching staff of each national team whenever there's going to be a game played by that national team. And this is considered a big honor to be able to represent your nation. And these national teams are the ones that appear in the World Cup, the European Championships, Copa America, the Gold Cup, competitions like that. National teams are run by federations, which are organizations commissioned by governments to run soccer in those nations. And that brings us to our show, We the Peeps. We're a podcast devoted to the US men's and women's national teams. So we follow the teams when they're playing, and we follow the players when they're with their club teams. And we are a beginner-friendly show. We try to keep it light, give you the chance to kind of learn all this stuff instead of just throwing terminology at you. So if you want to find our show, you can find us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, wherever. Just search We the Peeps. We will come right up. So players don't have to choose between playing for a club team and playing for a national team. They can do both. The organization that governs soccer is FIFA, and FIFA has a unified calendar that has certain spots in it that are designated for national team fixtures. So most professional club leagues will stop in those periods, and national teams will play instead. And the majority of the large international tournaments like the World Cup or the European Championships or the Gold Cup, those occur in June, July, when the club teams are not playing. So a top level player will play a full season for their club team and will also play maybe upwards of 20 games for their national team as well. Most national teams play only 15 to 20 times a year, and a given player may only appear in a handful of those games. In fact, the vast majority of professional players never get the opportunity to play on a national team at all. There are thousands of different professional clubs throughout the world, but there's obviously only a few hundred national teams. So the vast majority of the games that a high-level player plays are with their club team. A club team is a normal pro sports organization like the LA Lakers or New York Yankees, and they just try to attract the best players from wherever in the world that they can find them. Most club teams are for-profit businesses that are owned by wealthy individuals or an ownership group, a consortium. But some are kind of member clubs, nonprofits, or fan-owned enterprises as well. And almost every country has a professional league or even a series of interconnected professional leagues with promotion and relegation between them. And the very best teams from any individual nation are likely to also compete in tournaments against club teams from other nations. So that's not national team competition. That's club competitions that span different international leagues. So the most famous example of a competition like that is the European Champions League, which is probably the pinnacle of club soccer quality. But there's also a Champions League here in CONCACAF, which is the region that the United States is a part of. And there are multiple international competitions around the world like this. So a team like Barcelona certainly spiritually represents the city of Barcelona, but the players on that team will come from all over. In fact, they have 2 Americans on their team right now. They have Serginho Dest, who was born in the Netherlands and has American heritage, and Conrad de la Fuente, who was born in Miami. Meanwhile, national teams have very strict eligibility rules. Even if a player lives in a country for a long time, they might not be eligible. The rules are pretty complicated, but in general, if you feel like you belong to a certain nationality, if that's your identity, it's likely that you can play for that team. And many players actually have the opportunity of representing multiple countries, like someone like Sidney Leroux, who was born in Canada but has an American father, eventually chose to represent the US internationally. Now, most of the time, players can only ever play for one country. Even if they're eligible to play for multiple, they have to pick one country and stick with it. But there are some loopholes in those rules. So every now and then you'll get a player like Jermaine Jones, who played for Germany in some friendly matches and then ultimately switched to playing for the United States and became a true legend of US soccer. Now, while the federations that organize the national teams are nonprofits, obviously they take in a lot of money from sponsorship deals and ticket revenue and TV and all of that. So they do pay national team players for their appearances. So playing for your national team is an honor, but it is also potentially very lucrative. For the top players in the men's game, the money involved can be kind of a drop in the bucket if you're making millions of dollars a week. But sadly, in the women's game, salaries at the club level are incredibly low. In fact, for the NWSL, which is the top women's league here in the US, the normal maximum salary is $50,000 per season. So the top women's players, a lot of the time, the majority of their income is coming from their national team appearances. So both in the women's game and the men's game, the players have to balance club commitments with national team commitments. But a lot of the time in the women's game, the national teams will take priority because that's how the players are, really making a living. However, in the men's game, a lot of the time the national teams can become a risk for top players. You can imagine some players are making so much money with their club teams that they're literally setting themselves up for life financially. So taking long trips with their national team, maybe if they come from Africa and they play in Europe, or they come from South America and they play in Europe, that can represent a pretty substantial risk. So sometimes you'll see these players de-emphasizing their national team commitments and focusing more on their club careers. So if you came in with questions, I hope you're leaving with answers about how national teams work. If I left anything out, you're still wondering anything, please leave me a comment below. I'll be happy to answer any questions you may have. And if you are ready to catch US soccer fever, now is the perfect time. We have really exciting teams, both on the men's side and the women's side. So you can find our podcast on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify. Just search up We The Peeps. We will come right up. You can find us on Twitter at WTPpod and at WTPpod.com. Thanks so much for watching.
It's we the people. It's we the people. It's we the people. It's we the